Today we'll be talking about Dracula and Twilight and their shared themes of misogynism and toxic masculinity. Now, I know most people would expect that out of a Victorian era book from Dracula, written in 1897. Definitely that era between, well, any time before basically 1960, I would say. Women definitely took a secondhand role to men. It wasn't until the 70s where they really started picking up ground and men started seeing them as equal. And even today, you don't see that a lot. Um, but on the other hand, in Twilight, you would kind of expect that to ease up a little bit, especially in pop culture and the kind of young adult movement that went with it. You wouldn't expect that message to be sent to kids, you know. First, I'm going to take a few quotes from the book of Dracula. I'm going to kind of dissect them, point out the misogynistic, toxic masculinity parts, also a little bit of a rape scene, basically. And then I'm going to switch over into Twilight and kind of compare it to Dracula and show how similar they are, how similar Twilight's scenes are to Dracula's scenes, and they're both written 100 years apart. Now, that quote was very accurate of what I'm describing here. What stood out to me the most, though, is the attitude of the two had a terrible resemblance to a child forcing a kitten's nose into a saucer of milk to compel it to drink. Now, that's very rape-like. That's very aggressive. She's drinking his blood, but there's a sexual undertone to it. And so I kind of wanted to compare that quote to what goes on in Twilight. Now, it's not necessarily rape or, aggravated assault towards women, but there are some aggressive tendencies within the men of Twilight, just as there are in Dracula. Most of the men are very, quote unquote, strong. They're the leaders, and the women's are seen as a secondhand resource. Now, they might be smart, but then at the end of the day, you have these overpowering men who are currently controlling the fate of these women. And in an article I read from Psychology Today, Wind Goodfriend, PhD, here writes that Edward has basically some abusive tendencies. So I just wanted to quote her real quick. She said, Edward constantly forbids her from seeing Jacob, her being Bella, a potential rival, and he even sabotages her car so that she has no avenue of escape. Not my idea of romance. Now, reading that and kind of watching the films, two different things. When you see that in the film, it's portrayed as love, but in real life, if someone jacks your car up and just so you can't get away to see another man, that's abusive. And that being passed down to kids is not the best idea. And as I said earlier, you would kind of see how that fits the Victorian era way of thinking, but then you get to whenever it came out, 2008, I believe, and you think that those types of archetypes, I guess, would be gone in vampires by today's standards and what we deem acceptable. So, with that being said, I wanted to focus on Twilight, and this is kind of my point of my argument in that Twilight really supports the toxic masculinity vibe, I guess, in that Bella is very passive and Edward is a very aggressive character in the story. And as Anna Silver says in an article that I read by her called The Young Adult Novel, she says basically, Edward is exaggeratedly more active and confident than the generally passive, insecure Bella. Bella's clumsiness, of course, is not simply a sign of incompetence. Rather, she embodies inner physical klutziness, the adolescent girl, ill at ease in her new woman's body with her first emotions of first love and lust. So this kind of further proves my point that Bella here is very closely related to Mina and Dracula, in that she is kind of insecure, second to the man, or to the men, not just a man, to men in general, and that goes for the same as all female characters in both of these stories. And my argument basically is that we haven't changed very much. This Twilight saga was supposed to be kind of a modern spin on vampires, and it gained all this, critical fame. But when it comes down to it, it's not much different than what was written in, 1897. So I wanted to go back to Mina real quick from Dracula and kind of compare her to Bella. And in an article I read by Catherine Boyd, she has a pretty good take on Mina's situation, and I think it's pretty similar to Bella's. And I think that's pretty significant in that this is supposed to be Twilight's supposed to be a more modern issue, a more modern take on vampirism, and Dracula is obviously a 100-year-old tale. And these types of characters still have the same values, or the same, not values, but value to other people, I would say. So Boyd writes, Mina may be a working woman, but Ches seizes upon any signs of domestic behavior that Mina does in order to suggest that she is merely a pet for a group of men fighting Dracula. She then goes on to say, Mina acts as a source of relief for the male characters who find themselves in tears after Lucy's death, suggesting Mina as a mother figure, as a nurturing leader, and cohesive force. Now, earlier on in the Twilight Saga, Bella does not have this motherly figure. People don't come to her for comfort. It's usually the other way around. But as you can see here, Mina kind of being the only female around next to Lucy, who obviously was corrupted, I would say. She has this motherly figure to her, I guess, this motherly tone in the story. And I think that translates really pretty parallel to Twilight, in that Bella, once she becomes an actual mother, that these other people here, see her as relief, not necessarily a need, but they want her there for more emotional support. And, when she's not needed, she's not needed. She doesn't need to be around. They're off doing their own thing. And so I think this parallel between Mina and Bella really kind of embodies what I'm trying to talk about, in that this Dracula story and what Stoker created initially has basically stood the test of time, when really it's a misogynist, less female-driven story, and largely centered around men. Now, I know Bella has a large role in the story, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she is the centerpiece, because often she relies on, like I say over and over again, the men. And so what I'm just trying to get across here is that from Dracula to Twilight, and pretty much most things in between, men are still kind of driving the force here, driving the vampirical story. Now, there are women vampires, but they're often either portrayed as impure, or there's some sort of flaw to them. And so I think this kind of abusive relationship between Bella and Edward really speaks volumes to how literature has affected today's society, and what's wrong and what's right. And even kind of, you can see how within the last 10 years how things have changed. As I said earlier, I'm not sure that this movie could stand the test of time because of these factors. I mean, the overwhelming toxic masculinity that takes place here, and the lack of female motivation, I would say, or female security versus insecurity. There's a lot of that. And so what I believe is that Dracula kind of set the tone for what vampire stories are supposed to be. And I think as time has gone on, these things haven't changed very much. And for Twilight to be described as a young adult love story, I feel like it's not necessarily a love story, and that there's not, yes, they're in love, yes, they have a child, but there's a lot of abusive factors that go into that. And so, in my thinking, I just believe that Twilight has not necessarily pushed the envelope on being more self-aware as a woman, or the feminism movement. It's kind of a step backwards, in that so many young adults, young women, and young men even have taken a liking to this series, and yet it portrays something that we don't want in today's society. But back in 1897, as I keep referencing, that was something that was completely normal at the time. So when Stoker was writing it, he had no intention of, using these undertones of male dominance. He had no problem using it because that was just the norm at the time. But as Twilight was made and written, you can obviously see that that same mindset has basically stuck with writers throughout time.